Hi there, I'm Ken Lammers. This is Commonplace Catholic. Peace be with all y'all. This week, we're going to talk about something the Pope brought up in one of his homilies, practical atheism, or atheism generally. So, let's get to it.
Lord Jesus Christ,
युगान युग तेरा ही है.
Ilekroć bowiem sprawujemy pamiątkę ofiary Chrystusa,
Kweli ni vema na haki tukushukuru daima na popote, Bwana Baba mwema.
主の御体と御血になりますように。
Okay, so this week, I think in his first homily, or at least one of his first homilies, the Pope brought up practical atheism, which set me to thinking about, well, what is practical atheism? And, we know what it is, kind of, but and then it really kind of set me off, where does it come from? And I came up with a model that I think fits for the United States, right? It won't map onto other countries because there are certain historical things that happened in the U.S. that didn't happen elsewhere. Maybe close in Canada, but not really elsewhere. So I think we're going to run through this and see where it goes. First of all, though, let's look at what happened in the news this week. Leo the 14th, as the first American Pope, I think was urged and should put out some sort of encyclical, papal bull, whatever, declaring to 1.4 billion Catholics that it's called soccer. It's soccer, not football. In countries which have competing sports in that zone, it always gets called soccer. Not football in, Australia, not football in the United States or Canada. So soccer is the appropriate name. We can only hope that the Holy Father takes the appropriate position on this. And in more serious news, he did talk to the Eastern Rite priests in the Catholic Church. The Eastern Catholics praised them for holding to their old Reform worships and the mystery in those, and that set off a spiral of, ooh, is he going to bring back Latin Mass? Is he going to say Latin Mass is okay? Is he going to roll back Pope Francis's kind of irrational fight against the Latin Mass? We'll see. Everybody who's seen me here knows what my opinion is. Let them have their Latin Mass. Yeah, moving away from Latin was an error, but going back and trying to force it on everybody would be a huge error too. Just let the ones who want to do it, right? It won't cause a problem. It'll be like one parish per diocese, if that. Okay, a ceasefire between Pakistan and India, so at least for the moment, let's pray that nobody, gets itchy trigger finger and we get headed back towards a potential nuclear war again. Trump went over to the Middle East, Qatar, he got offered a plane. Lots of fussing about that with the media. And he de-emphasized, or seemed to de-emphasize, Israel, which caused a lot of fussing with certain people. And he did not say that we would stop giving them weapons and ammunition as their primary supplier there. But he did seem to be not happy that Gaza isn't being resolved, right? And then, of course, we found out that Biden has cancer, an aggressive form of cancer, but we're told can be treated. We'll see how well that goes. And God bless him. I hope it goes well. But that, of course, set off a series of, ooh, did he have it while he was in office? Was that part of his cognitive decline? Probably not. The cognitive decline was actually observable far before then, right? So far before any aggressive form of cancer would seem to have affected him. So, leave that to y'all. Go look up all these. And again, remember, urged the Pope to put out an encyclical, papal, whatever, saying that soccer is soccer. Now, having gotten that out of my system, when one of his first homilies, maybe his first one, the Pope said this: "Today, too, there are many settings in which Jesus, although appreciated as a man, is reduced to a kind of charismatic leader or Superman. This is true not only among non-believers, but also among many baptized Christians, who end up living at this level in a state of practical atheism." Now, I don't know so much about the Superman part, but he's just a charismatic leader thing. I experienced that myself in school, so that is for real. Now, what I started thinking about this. How do we figure out what exactly, where did this come from, right? And you could get into the weeds on this. Are these people who you're hardcore, go to church every week, do everything by the book types called social Catholics or social Christians? No, I don't think they are. The fact that somebody goes to church on Easter and Christmas, right, or that they, once a month or something like that, and you don't appreciate the fact that they're doing that, doesn't make them non-Christian, non-Catholic, right? It may mean that somebody you should draw in more, but it doesn't mean they're outside of the church. These are people who, don't. You get some people that straight up say I'm atheist, but most people aren't bleak enough for that, right? And then you get others that say they're agnostic. I did this when I was in high school, right? I couldn't go to atheist because I could see, right? And I don't know that I had studied Thomistic theory or anything at that point, or really haven't studied it now, so let's not pretend. But I could see first cause, right? There was a first cause, and that's what we call God. And then I realized that after that, in my head, it was all faith, right? It's what you made from that point on. It took me a while, but I kind of matured past that, right, and moved into actually trying to have a true faith. So a lot of us have gone through some of this, but then you have people who, if you push them, they'll say, yeah, I'm a Lutheran, a Baptist, a Catholic, an Orthodox, whatever. And what they mean is, my great-grandparents went to church all the time. My grandparents went to church. My parents kind of went to church and, made sure I got baptized. And I haven't done anything in the church in the last 30 years, right? That's your practical atheist. So how does this happen? And I have a chart that I worked up about how it happened in the United States, or how it happens in the United States. I will tell you that, like all models, it has flaws. You will be able to point at it and say, no, that's wrong there. I know somebody who contradicts that. Yes, you will, because models always deal in generalities and not the exceptions, right? It will have all that sort of thing. You'll be able to poke all sorts of holes in it. I still think that it is a good place to start if you're looking at what the causes of practical atheism are in the United States. I will say I don't think this maps onto other countries, because other countries have different issues, and the United States has some things that are unique to it. So let's look at the model I came up with. This is a model, and you'll notice it's broken down into two parts. There's working class, and there is the keyboard class. Now, I did not make up the keyboard class name. It is something that I can't remember where I saw it first at, but I think it's a good denomination for the people in this group, because it's not just people who went to college. It's people who are swayed heavily in general by people who've gone to college and that sort of thing, live in a college town, who work in a job that's, uses their brains, their mouths, and their, and are in that echo chamber with all these folks, right? That's the keyboard class. These aren't people who swing picks and axes, or, fix pipes. So that's where they are. And despite what you might seem to think, and what the news always seems to think, these are not the majority of people in the United States, which is always a shock to them when election time comes around. But so how does the keyboard class end up being functionally or practically atheistic? Well, you start back in American history and problems in American history with Protestants trying to suppress Catholicism, and what you end up with now, socialists were involved in this, others as well. Protestants, though, had general control of the community, and it was them that made the choice. But what you ended up with was the passage of laws meant to suppress Catholicism, right? Meant to force Catholics to go to public schools, Blaine amendments, that sort of thing. Meant to force Catholics to operate in a less Catholic way, or whatever you want to say, and with the thought process being they become Protestant because the public schools were by osmosis Protestant. Well, the problem here is that when you write laws like that, the United States forever has had this rule: you can't pick out one religion and go against it, right? But you can make general rules which can harm a particular religion. And so, with a stunning lack of foresight, some of our forefathers made general rules that they thought would only apply to Catholics. And so you get Blaine amendments, you get other laws, statutes, you get case law that says this and that. And eventually that hits everybody, not just Catholics. And let me say, they don't. While I think the majority of their targets were Catholics, I'm sure they wanted people who were Jewish that came to the United States to be sucked in as well. Orthodox, anybody that ended up from Asia, they wanted them to be sucked in and brought into some mainline Protestant religion too, right? Okay, so all these rules, general rules, get into the government, and the government then, by its own rules, initially not necessarily enforced across the board, but eventually pretty much segregates religion out. Religion can't get anything from the government. It's not supposed to really influence the government. It is the whole separation of church and state thing, which, as we all know, is not in the Constitution, is just a letter that Jefferson wrote to some preachers, some Baptist preachers, and they do this whole thing, right? Well, of course, initially this affects K through 12, because that was a lot of Catholic schools, and that were either closed down or they were taken over by, if I recall, one place they just took over to Catholic schools, that sort of thing. And at first this is viewed as a good thing by majority of people in this country because they were Protestant and didn't have the foresight to realize this would eventually come back and bite them. It then goes, K through 12 is influenced by this, shorn of religion. Religion becomes a second tier, second class thing because it's not taught in schools and where you're taught your important things you need for life, right? It also, in K through 12, as we all know and have seen from watching various and sundry YouTube videos you can see all over the place, that if you don't have, Christian morality being taught in school, Catholic morality, whatever, being taught in school, it gets filled by other things. Things that, the religious morality would consider disordered, get taught by some teachers who purposely go there, right? Rather than staying neutral, which is where they ought to. And this is an effect of this whole practical atheism thing. Okay, so that's K through 12, but that's not really the big catch. The big catch is the colleges. And once colleges start getting grants and start getting student loans and start taking the government's money, they have to play by the government's rules, right? So the government says you got to segregate out and make religion a second tier, second class thing. And suddenly the colleges make religion second tier, second class thing. I have a kind of a large experience in this, right? I went to a Presbyterian college. Or, let me say, a college that was founded by Presbyterians. Didn't see a thing of Presbyterianism on there. There was nothing that would indicate that school was in any way attached to the Presbyterian Church. I think there was a chapel on campus. Actually, yeah, there was a chapel on campus. It was this little tiny room in the, that I think was halfway being used for storage, not being used for any kind of chapel activities or any other activities, and had nothing in there to indicate it has anything to do with Christianity. Maybe a stained glass window at most, but nothing else. Kind of sad, actually. I think I went there once because some on campus student group, Christian group, was meeting there, and I ended up kind of walking away from that. But so the government goes on with this, and I further experiences that, right? I chose as one of my majors in college a religion major, secular study of religion, in which I was translating the Quran and Hadiths from Islam against Hebrew from the Old Testament, Tanakh, however you want to say it, right? This was not, any kind of religious polemics or anything like that, or apologetics. This was me doing entirely in a academic way, comparing things that were in the two books and that sort of thing. I had money taken away from me by the state of Kentucky because I did that. I think it was a Pell Grant, if I remember what it was. They yanked it and sent me a letter saying, you don't get this money because you declared a religion major. Right? So that's how far they were going. And it feeds into a loop, right? So you get these kids that go to these schools, and Christianity is de-emphasized, second tier, second class. It's not an important thing, right? And so, and then I'll tell you other things like when the Pope says that he's seen as a charismatic man, that's kind of what you're taught. What I was taught. I'm taking religion class. You had to take 2 religion classes. It was very much a secular deconstruction type of thing, or comparative type of thing. It wasn't really anything having to teach you with a point of view, right? And taking those classes, I remember consistently the term itinerant Jewish preacher or itinerant Jewish prophet, depending upon which text you were reading. And that was a way they described Jesus, right? Which is a far reach away from Son of God, 2 natures, 1 being, right? Long way away from that, right? And that's what they were basically teaching as this is what Jesus was, right? And to the point, I can remember at one point, this is taught as a theory, that there was a theory that there were 2 groups of people who from Israel, Jewish groups. There was one that was around the Jesus myth, and there was one around John the Baptist myth, right? And they competed for followers in that at the beginning, and then it became clear that the Christians were going to win that competition, and then the Christians wrote in all the stuff about John the Baptist and the interaction with Jesus, so that the followers of John the Baptist would swing into Christianity. This was taught as a theory. We were taught no countermanding theories, and as you know, anybody who's had like geometry in that, if you're taught a theory but not taught any countermanding theory, that theory is basically being taught to you as law, law, right? So I remember getting taught that. So just very de-emphasizing. If you get anything about Jesus, it's de-emphasis, right? So then you get people who've gone through that. And mind you, there were some very religious kids at my school, but they really weren't the mainstream kids, right? They were kind of segregated, and there were some interesting people in that group. But not to say there weren't some interesting people in groups I hung out with either, but there were some interesting people in that group. But your general, upper level person coming out of school generally is and going to end up back in government. He's taught that religion is something that has to be segregated, it has to be washed out. We can't have religion as part of our government and all that. And they, come to this kind of view of religion as this quaint thing from the past. It's not really something that it's an imaginary thing we shouldn't really be paying that much attention to, right? This, by the way, is where you get the trendy atheists. They come in here too. We'll all recall like the last 10, maybe 15 years, maybe a little bit longer, depending on who you count. There was a trendy atheist thing. They were edgy, new, cutting edge, very trendy, and they weren't raising any issues that hadn't been raised by 500 AD, right? But they were the cool thing, and that would be like the Four Horsemen, and then later on, guys on YouTube and you'll notice that's all fallen off because they're not trendy and new and edgy anymore. They're just that guy, right? So they've fallen off without as much influence, but that doesn't mean that the circle here isn't still going, right? The government being more now influenced by kids who have been taught that Jesus is just some itinerant preacher and we need to segregate everything out and religion is a second-class thing, then makes rules that go back to the schools, colleges, which then pass people who are even more emphasized that religion is a second-class thing, and it just a circle, right? This has been going on for a while now, and it has had obvious influence. You can see it. And so all of these tend to happen, and even people who hang on to kids who hang on and have I am Lutheran because, well, my grandfather was Lutheran, my parents were at least nominally Lutheran, I'm Lutheran, and really never step into a church. Practical atheists, colleges grind those out every day. And, because the colleges then send people to teach at K through 12, K through 12 is grinding it out, and having some really interesting people who become teachers who ought not to, who are, because of their disorders under practical atheism, trying to influence children when they ought not to be. Right? And of course the government itself tends towards practical atheism. Now, having said all that, I will say over the last, I'd say the last few decades, and it has been more snowballing in more recent times, last few decades, the Supreme Court of the United States has been, vetoing or stamping down on some of this stuff, right? Because the whole thing about absolutely cutting out religion has been ruled by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. So, in other words, what I mean is, I think the first case was, I can't remember the name of it, but I think it was a Lutheran school that, elementary school, that put in for a grant that the city was giving to fix up their playground, right? And the city said, nope. Yeah, you're the best suited for it. We know that. And you probably need it the most. We know that. And you fit every criteria. We know that. But because you're Lutheran, we're not doing it, right? And that went all to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't just say you're the most qualified, you fit absolutely, but because you're religious, we're gonna be prejudiced against you, right? Um, that's been a rule that's been around for a while now, and now we see it more and more in schools, right? A cynical person would say that this really kind of hit because the kind of hit because as time went along and Protestants started forming their own schools as opposed to Catholics having their university schools, their K through 12s, the Protestants started running into things that the Catholics have been dealing with for, 100 years or so, right? And they started bucking, and that led to fights across the board. Blaine amendments just keep getting knocked down by the Supreme Court of the United States. I think they're going to handle another one this term. I think they've already had oral arguments on it, actually. And so, the rule now seems to be if you're a school that fits all the criteria, you teach reading, writing, arithmetic, right? Just because you're Catholic, Lutheran, Presbyterian, whatever, that doesn't mean the government can deny you grants that they would give to any other school that fits the same criteria, right? Just because you are, good school plus religion as opposed to just good school, that doesn't mean that you get denied, right? The government cannot deny you for that. And that's, that blows the Blaine amendments out, right? Out of the water. Doesn't mean that they don't still exist. The states hang on to these things like they're their kids, right? I mean, Virginia's still got two Blaine amendments in its constitution, despite being ever so proud about its freedom of religion clause at the very beginning in its constitution. So that's there. So there are hiccups. The slowly but surely the ship may be getting turned some here. There are also colleges that won't take government money because that's the way you stay away from this stuff, like Hillsdale or Ave Maria, that sort of thing, where there are attempts to make an actual religious school, right? We'll see how that all turns out in the long term. Well, y'all will probably see it more than I will. But 100 years from now, this may seem like a silly model. But as of now, and through the last few decades, this has been the model for like since maybe, I don't know, let's say 1960s, 50s. And it has been a self-reinforcing model. Like I said, goes around and around. And we'll see how that turns out in the end. Maybe the fighting back will end up actually putting religion back in some schools, and the keyboard class will somewhat turn back. And then we get the working class and how some of them ended up out. Now, this is, I have to say, this really is something that started first with Catholics more than Protestants. And we got Vatican II. Now, Vatican II unto itself, I don't think is harmful unto itself. The spirit of Vatican II was a disaster, an absolute disaster. The heterodox went nuts, crazy, bonkers right? This is where you started seeing, you went from having a choir there singing hymns of faith to guys sitting up there going, ding, 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 our Father, on a banjo, right? Um, that was disturbing. And, you know, this is where you had clown masses and all sorts of things like that. And the clergy took what clergy didn't leave. There was a lot of clergy that left in these periods, and nuns, etc. But the clergy went left, right? And some of the laity went left with them, but I get the feeling that a fair amount of the laity that would have gone left went, why am I here? There's no point. This is just what I see in everyday life. Church didn't provide me the extra morality. I'm gone, right? They departed. And again, they might stay there Catholic, but they're not really, right? But I will say in the Catholic Church, the majority of the laity that stayed in the center and just kind of looked up and went, "Oh, Father Tom has gone nuts again. Okay, I'm just gonna sit it out. I'm gonna get my communion, and I'm gonna come back next week and get my communion, and we're just not going to engage with this silliness, right?" And over time, and of course the people on the right, the traditionalists, pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, right? There may not be a huge number of them, but boy, they try hard. And So I think between the vast majority of the laity staying here and those on the right pushing right, the church swung back some, right? And it has been a better thing for it. But a lot of those people who went out left, they just left and basically became practical atheists as the church went left. Now, this seems to have taken longer for Protestants. I think Protestant churches seem to stay conservative longer than the Catholic churches did, but when it hit, and it hit hard. Now, the term I've heard for this, and to play off the Great Awakenings, but is the Great Awakening, right? This is when you got, and this is an influence out of colleges, etc. You got churches that just mainline denominations just went, nope, we're just going to go left. We are going to embrace societal mores instead of Christian mores, right? And that they went that way. Now, the thing is, of course, Protestantism works differently than Catholics. If my bishop goes one direction, my parishes have to go that direction pretty much, and that's the way it is, right? But obviously, denominations in Protestantism there's a lot more you can leave, right? And we've all seen that recently with the Methodists, United Methodists, where they both had a lot of churches leave. One of the local churches around here did it. Or they've had churches which they've sued to keep from leaving, right? Or have taken the land from when the people of the church decided they didn't want to be there, didn't want to be United Methodists anymore, that sort of thing. But there have been, a lot of churches can go where they're going to go under Protestantism, even if the mainline denomination is going left and going nuts. And some of the churches did go left with the church, with their denomination, and some of the laity goes that way too. But I think this is also where you see a lot of drop off, exit out of the church. Now that kind of can happen two ways, right? Your laity just leave and just say, yeah, I'm Lutheran, yeah, I'm Presbyterian, whatever, but don't do anything having to really do with the faith, and follow really any principles having to do with the faith. But on the other hand, churches can go on their own, and I think this is something that happened more in Protestantism. They went off on their own, and some of them just split off altogether and became evangelical, which I like to tell you I could pin down what an evangelical is, but from church to church to church, that seems to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Um, Sometimes even going as far as to walk away from the Trinity, which you can't call yourself Christian if you walk away from the Trinity, really. And then you get, of course, things like non-denominationals, which end up being with things like there can be small non-denominationals, but you also end up with mega churches, right? And the which tend to grow and fade over time, right? And then you get the prosperity gospel people, which are disturbing and take advantage of their laity and preach heresy, in my opinion. But all these, what all this happens if you don't have a church that's in a denomination that's moved off on its own, or is like, you know, it seems to be a lot of those become how popular is the preacher, and once he's gone, what happens, right? Because there's no real pipeline from a denomination anymore. Uh, Now, some of them are kind of hiding the fact that they're like really Baptists, or something like that, just claiming to be non-denominational. But it makes for a far less stable thing. But that's something to get into in another time. But so when you get these from the left, they go away. They leave because the church has gone so far left. Whether it's because they're not going to go that far, or because why am I in a church that just tells me the same thing that I get off the evening news, that I should have this or that moral stance. But they leave and they become practical atheists. Before somebody says something, yes, if a church moved to the right, I'm sure the same thing would happen. Unfortunately, but we've not seen that, right? Churches haven't gone to the right. I mean, I'm sure there are some groups, but a majority of the churches, Catholic clergy, whether it be Catholic clergy or that be Protestant mainline denominations that have gone left. They have not gone right. I mean, the nearest thing to hold the line, I guess, is the Southern Baptists. That's not really a denomination; it's more of an association, and it doesn't really set rules for its people, so you can come in and out. And on top of which, they seem to have gotten more liberal. That's my feeling in the last few times I've met. I'm not sure if that's entirely true or not, but it seems to be. And so that's where you get a lot of your working class folks. They just kind of walk away, right? If you got a preacher up there or a priest up there who's waving the pride flag and all that, and your guy back here who worked with a wrench all week long is looking up and going, what? How is this relevant to me at all? Let's even assume he doesn't have a negative reaction. Let's just assume he just sits there going, how is this relevant? And where's the morality here? And he just goes, I'm out. So that I think has hurt a lot. I do think that somewhat, I can't speak so much for a lot of the Protestant denominations, although there does seem to be some pushback as opposed to just schisming from your denomination and leaving. But there does seem some pushback there. But, in the Catholic faith, there's definitely been pushback, right? A serious pushback where the laity, if nothing else, can end up crossways with the clergy somewhat. And we're going to have to see how that turns out. And hopefully the new pope will smooth that some. But okay, so all these end up going into practical atheism, right? People, working class people basically being pushed out of the churches or not seeing a reason to be there or whatever, and going on. Um, you know, the keyboard class folks with that, doggone self reinforcing circle in the middle, uh, you know, they're, you know, they're taught religion is a second class thing and it's really something that it's quaint past thing and you should really let that go and act along those lines, right? And all this leads to your practical atheism. What practical atheism leads to is, well, that's another whole lecture. And it ain't a good thing. But that's where we are. I can't tell you how many people are in practical atheism. And a lot of this, how are you going to tell? If somebody is basically, a social Catholic or a social Christian, meaning they do come occasionally, they do, take the sacraments, they do what they're supposed to at time, and they come to church every so often. They're just not as enthusiastic about it as you are. Um, I think there are people who will try to push them into the practical atheism part. It's not the same thing. These are just people who are not as attached as you'd like. You should try to get them to be more attached, but they are still there in the faith and trying and making efforts, right? As opposed to people who just go, "Yeah, I'm Lutheran," but practical atheism. You want an actual example of this, and I talked about this last week or week before. The governor of the state of Washington passed a law requiring priests to break the seal of the confession while claiming to be Catholic. He's not Catholic. He's an atheist, right? He is outside of the church. If he hasn't been excommunicated, well, he's kind of excommunicated himself. But that's, that is practical atheism in action. And other things that would be much more controversial to say are practical atheism in action. And I leave you to your own imagination to figure that out. So, having said all that, folks, let me say I want you to think about these sort of things and look to see where all this is. Do some research. Yeah, you're going to find flaws in my model. I guarantee it, right? There are flaws. But as a general thing, I think it works pretty well, right? You'll look at this model and go, well, yeah, generally that's where it is. Yes, the colleges are the strong point of making religion not something anymore, right? And that comes out of the government pushing them. And it also comes out of, like Marxist theology and stuff that gets in there. But or ideology. I guess we don't call it theology if it's Marxist. But that all feeds from the government too. I mean, it's kind of like I say, it's a feedback loop. And that's about where I'm going to go with that. I invite you all to look at this yourself and figure it out. As I always say, I mean, if you like this video, hit like. If you dislike the video, sorry, I'm just telling you the way I see it. If you really like the video, hit the bell so that you can get notifications and subscribe and all that. And beyond that, folks, as I always say, I can go back to my old saying now. This has no imprimatur. It has not been approved from the lowest hermit all the way up to Pope Leo XIV. Nobody in the church has approved this. These are my thoughts as a Catholic living a Catholic life, or trying to live a Catholic life at least. And until next time, folks, go out, have some fun, have a blessed week.